Hi everyone, welcome back to Difference Frames the World, a channel to see the world from a different angle. Today, we analyze the US strike on Venezuela, and see if Beijing can follow Trump's suit, and capture Taiwan's Lai Ching-te, just as the US kidnapped Maduro and his wife.
Late last night and early today, at my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II. It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the...
On the internet, netizens ridiculed America's military action, saying Venezuela defeated the United States in less than 90 minutes, with only 2 captured, a big victory of the Venezuelan people. Some even say that Donald Trump unilaterally invited Maduro and his wife to the United States for a criminal visit, and greeted them with the world's best security measures. We feel sorry for Venezuela, a victim of the Monroe Doctrine. Even if Maduro is a tyrant, dictator, and a criminal, he is a foreign head of state, a counterpart of Donald Trump himself. Arresting a foreign national leader, or in better words, kidnapping a foreign president, is unbelievable for the world. In the past decade, the U.S. Department of Justice has indicted Venezuelan President Maduro and multiple Venezuelan senior officials on charges of narcoterrorism, offering large bounties, with reasons including suspected cooperation with transnational drug trafficking organizations and participation in protecting smuggling routes. Donald Trump, who returned to the White House in January 2025, made combating drug trafficking groups a core part of his immigration enforcement and border security policies. White House spokesperson Leavitt stated that Trump would use all means to stop the drug flood. Since August last year, the U.S. government has taken a series of actions against Venezuela on the grounds of suspected involvement in drug trafficking. In August 2025, under the pretext of cracking down on drug trafficking groups, the United States deployed multiple warships in Caribbean waters near Venezuela, claiming it was the largest fleet in South American history, including aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. Since September 2025, the U.S. military has claimed to have sunk about 20 so-called drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean Sea and Eastern Pacific, causing more than 70 deaths. In October 2025, Donald Trump said he had authorized the CIA to carry out covert operations in Venezuela, and claimed the Pentagon was considering launching anti-drug strikes inside Venezuelan territory, which came true on January 3, 2026. On December 16, 2025, Trump stated on social media that Venezuela's current government was a foreign terrorist organization, and ordered a comprehensive and thorough blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuela. Chinese oil from Venezuela was also sent to U.S. refineries. It is a good textbook for Beijing to study if President Xi Jinping is a real wolf warrior. Taiwan's DPP party should now understand how lucky Taiwan has been in the past 8 decades. If it were not part of China and far away from the Caribbean, could it still claim to be a so-called democratic state? 23 million people on the island are lucky because Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, and China is one of the very few countries in the world that can say no to the imperialists. If not, TSMC would have also become a drug trafficker, and all its facilities would have been moved to the United States. The founder of TSMC said he was an American after he moved to the U.S. in the 1960s, but his face tells a different story. TSMC is a Taiwanese company, and if Beijing unites with Taiwan, it will become the asset of America's rival. What would the U.S. deal with TSMC if Beijing is not strong enough to counter the U.S. and its allies in the West Pacific? What crimes will the U.S. invent to frame TSMC to confiscate it accordingly? Look at Venezuela. Taiwan is, if not weaker than Venezuela, as weak as it is. Listen to what Venezuela's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said in September 2025, citing conclusive evidence that shows Venezuela has no drug processing organizations or cultivation bases. The US knows Venezuela is more innocent than Venezuela thinks it is innocent itself. U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration reports from 2024 to 2025 likewise show that Venezuela is neither listed as a drug-producing country nor a distribution country nor a transit country. Venezuela does not produce, traffic, or cultivate drugs, nor is it a drug distribution hub. Reports from all professional institutions show that Venezuela is absolutely not an important participant in this field. The White House does not need evidence to prove Venezuela's so-called crimes. Donald Trump was angry for losing the Nobel Peace Prize in 2025, so he gave himself a war prize in early 2026 to show his frustration. It is not funny. Rather, it is a pity for the so-called rules-based international order. On the other hand, the international community generally believes that Washington's unilateral and excessive law enforcement against other countries' vessels in so-called international waters, infringing on the right to life and other basic human rights of relevant personnel, seriously violates other countries' sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights, and seriously violates international law. So what is the U.S. military mobilization really for? In the early hours of January 4 Beijing time, Trump held a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, where he bluntly stated that the United States would next control Venezuela, as well as control Venezuela's world's largest oil reserves. Trump said that U.S. major oil companies would be allowed to enter Venezuela, deeply participate in its oil industry, invest tens of billions of dollars to repair severely damaged infrastructure, especially oil infrastructure, and begin generating profits. Trump stated that the embargo on all Venezuelan oil remains fully in effect. He said the United States would allow oil to resume normal supply and ensure that the Venezuelan people are properly taken care of. In response, Venezuelan Vice President Rodriguez bluntly stated that the U.S. government is attempting to overthrow Venezuela's legitimate government, and the real purpose is to plunder Venezuela's oil resources. In other words, the United States is using anti-drug as a pretext to carry out intervention. Data show that Venezuela has superior natural resources, with proven oil reserves of 300 billion barrels, ranking first in the world. The oil industry is the lifeline of the national economy. It is noteworthy that 7% of China's oil imports were from Venezuela, and Chinese President Xi Jinping and Maduro have built a good relationship. Maduro once told President Xi Jinping that they were fighting for the same cause. As we said in the first video about the strike, the U.S. wanted to stop China from purchasing oil from Venezuela. According to existing media reports, the U.S. military's action went very smoothly, encountering no effective or strong counterattack. Some netizens doubt that the Venezuelan military should have been paid by the U.S. intelligence to keep silent when the strike was on. China accused the U.S. of its military action against Venezuela being a naked act of imperialism, which will bring an extremely strong shock to Latin America. There was no evidence showing that the Venezuelan military had effectively exchanged fire with U.S. forces, even though several firefights were reported during the withdrawal after Maduro and his wife's capture. It is very scary. That is to say, in just a few hours, the United States completed a so-called law enforcement operation against another country's head of state. The harm is extremely great, and the humiliation is extremely strong. The psychological shock to other Latin American countries should be very large. It is worse than the eight-nation alliance that plagued Beijing in the last century, when the Qing emperor and his top officials hastily fled. Insiders familiar with CIA operations revealed that starting in August 2025, the CIA deployed a secret action team in Venezuela, specializing in collecting information on Maduro's daily routine and movements. At a press conference held at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, after the military operation, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff stated that the military action in Venezuela was launched at the request of the Department of Justice, and the operation was codenamed Absolute Resolve. He said that after months of effort by intelligence teams, the U.S. side locked onto Maduro's whereabouts, mastering his movements, where he lived, travel routes, dietary habits, clothing preferences, and even the pets he kept. At 22:46 Eastern Time on January 2, at the order of President Trump, U.S. military aircraft took off from 20 land and sea-based locations across the Western Hemisphere. More than 150 aircraft were launched, including bombers, fighter jets, intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance aircraft, and rotorcraft. As forces approached Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, joint air forces began dismantling and paralyzing Venezuela's air defense systems, and used weapons to ensure the safe entry of helicopters into the target area. Helicopter formations flew at low altitude toward the target and arrived at Maduro's residence at 1 a.m. on the 3rd. At 2 a.m., capture teams entered the residence and sealed off the area to ensure the safety of ground forces. When reaching the target area and carrying out the arrest, helicopters came under attack and responded with overwhelming firepower in self-defense. One U.S. aircraft was hit but remained flyable. Ultimately, Maduro and his wife were captured. During the withdrawal from Venezuela, multiple self-defense firefights occurred. The forces successfully withdrew and returned to naval vessels at 3:29 a.m. on the 3rd. Donald Trump posted a picture of Maduro on the U.S. ship with his eyes covered. The capture of Venezuela's sitting president, Maduro, by the United States means that Venezuela's domestic situation will face enormous uncertainty. Some analyses believe that Venezuela may next enter a prolonged period of political struggle, with a vice president or other ruling party leaders temporarily assuming the presidency. At the same time, various forces and foreign powers compete behind the scenes. The core demand of the U.S. afterward will likely be to support a pro-U.S. regime, with the essential purpose still being control of Venezuela's oil resources. Trump held a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, where he bluntly stated that the United States would next control Venezuela, saying that the U.S. will continue to take charge of the country until it can safely, properly, and fairly complete the transfer of power. Trump added at the press conference that decisions were being made about the next leadership arrangements for Venezuela. In response to the question of who will govern Venezuela, he said the U.S. will be deeply involved. Trump affirmed that Maduro's loyal factions will face a bad future. He hinted at the likelihood that the U.S. would study whether opposition leader Maria Corina Machado would lead Venezuela. Machado, 58 years old, is a member of Venezuela's Liberal Party. In 2014, she was investigated for suspected treason. During the 2024 Venezuelan presidential election, she accused the Maduro government of election fraud and organized supporters to launch anti-government activities. She was later accused of inciting violent protests and coup attempts, and Maduro issued an arrest warrant against her. She therefore won the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. Regarding Donald Trump's calculations, Venezuelan Vice President Rodriguez said that Venezuela had previously warned that an invasion masked by false pretexts and false reasons was underway, with the sole goal of achieving regime change in Venezuela. Rodriguez stated that Venezuela has formally convened a National Defense Council meeting, which solemnly demanded the immediate release of Maduro and his wife. Rodriguez said that Maduro is Venezuela's only legitimate president, and that the country will never become a colony of any nation. The situation in Venezuela may even trigger turbulence across Latin America. At the Mar-a-Lago press conference, Trump also issued threats to Cuba and Colombia. He warned Colombian President Gustavo Petro to be careful. He also commented on tensions with Cuba, stating that Cuba is a seriously failed country and that the United States wants to help the Cuban people. Trump said he would never allow terrorists and criminals to roam free and harm the United States. This operation serves as a warning to anyone who threatens U.S. sovereignty or endangers American lives. Analysts pointed out that Trump was hinting that, as tensions in Latin America escalate, the United States may expand its focus from Venezuela to more countries. Donald Trump hopes to establish U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere by cutting into Venezuela through this military action. Why did the United States suddenly launch a military operation against Venezuela at the beginning of the new year? The answer is the return of the Monroe Doctrine with fewer layers of filters. Maduro is the first prey and victim of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Overthrowing the Venezuelan government was a long-planned action by the U.S. government. In December last year, the Trump administration released a new national security strategy, viewing the Western Hemisphere as the front line for U.S. border security, key supply chains, and geopolitical competition, and prioritizing the establishment of U.S. primacy in the Western Hemisphere. The core of this strategy is the readjustment of the U.S. military presence in the Western Hemisphere to address immigration, drug smuggling, and other issues. The strategy claims this is the so-called Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The new NSS document has clearly revealed a major adjustment in U.S. foreign and security strategy priorities, Western Hemisphere first. From the Chavez era to the present, Venezuela has always been at the forefront of anti-U.S. forces in Latin America, and Maduro is a symbolic anti-U.S. figure. Maduro even treated Chinese President Xi Jinping as a comrade in the common cause of fighting U.S. imperialism. As a result, Maduro became the first prey and victim of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The so-called Monroe Doctrine was a foreign policy proposal put forward by then U.S. President James Monroe in his 1823 State of the Union address. At that time, Monroe put forward the claim that the Americas belong to the Americans, advocating turning Latin America and even the Western Hemisphere into the U.S. sphere of influence. For more than 200 years, the United States has adhered to the Monroe Doctrine to invade Latin American countries, engineer coups, impose sanctions, and carry out infiltration, plundering resources, seizing benefits, and controlling lifelines at the expense of other countries' interests to serve its global dominance. Since last year, the United States has taken repeated heavy measures against multiple Latin American countries, intensifying tensions between the U.S. and Latin America. Regarding Washington's new defense layout in Latin America, Bolivian President Arce pointed out its essence, nothing but a new variant of the Monroe Doctrine, a resurgence of neocolonialism. At a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, Trump emphasized that the U.S. oil embargo on Venezuela remains fully effective. He vigorously promoted the Monroe Doctrine and the Trump Doctrine, stating that America's dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never again be questioned. U.S. media have called the Trump administration's Latin America policy the Trump Doctrine, meaning the Donald Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine. Donald Trump is not the first U.S. president to revive the Monroe Doctrine, and he is not the last. The Monroe Doctrine is the DNA of the United States. In October 1983, the United States launched an armed invasion of Grenada to safeguard its Caribbean interests. On October 13 that year, a military coup occurred in Grenada. The U.S. cited emergency requests from Caribbean states and protection of its citizens to formulate the Operation Urgent Fury invasion plan. At dawn on October 25, U.S. forces launched simultaneous assaults from the northeast and southwest. By the afternoon of the 28th, after intense street fighting, they occupied St. George's, ending the battle. Grenada is a small Caribbean island nation with a population of slightly over 100,000, mainly dependent on agriculture. The U.S. military action caused massive shock, casualties, and destruction of its limited industries and infrastructure. On December 20, 1989, U.S. President Bush ordered the U.S. military to launch a military operation against Panama, codenamed Just Cause, attacking key military targets in 5 directions. Panama Defense Forces commander and government leader Noriega led the resistance but was overwhelmed. In just 15 hours, U.S. forces controlled most Panamanian barracks and overthrew the Noriega government. At 8:48 p.m. on January 3, 1990, Noriega was forced to surrender. The U.S. government later supported pro-U.S. Guillermo Endara to take power. Analysis found that after taking power, Noriega adopted a tough stance toward the United States, demanding that the U.S. comply with the Panama Canal Treaty, return sovereignty over the canal, and withdraw its troops, which angered the U.S. The invasion aimed to delay the transfer of canal operating rights and strengthen U.S. control over Panama. In 1990, Noriega was taken to Miami for trial. In 1992, a U.S. court sentenced him to 40 years for drug trafficking and extortion, later reduced to 17 years. Maduro is another Noriega, and we do not know whether he can luckily get out of prison alive. The U.S. military operation in Venezuela has shattered one of the strongest taboos in international politics, the physical seizure of a sitting head of state without a declared war. In a matter of hours, U.S. forces entered Venezuelan territory, neutralized defenses, captured President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, and removed them from the country. Washington called it an arrest. Caracas called it an invasion. Much of the world watched in disbelief. The shockwaves from this operation extend far beyond Latin America. One question is now quietly circulating in diplomatic and security circles across Asia. If the United States can seize Venezuela's president, could China one day capture Taiwan's leader, Lai Ching-te? It is not a question about intent alone. It is a question about precedent, power, and the erosion of rules. For decades, international norms, however imperfect they are, held that abducting a sitting head of state was beyond the pale except during full-scale war or regime collapse. That line has now been crossed. Washington justified its action using three arguments: criminal accusations of narcoterrorism, national security threats, and moral language about democracy or international order. These justifications matter because they are transferable. Beijing already frames Taiwan's leadership in criminal terms, labeling pro-independence figures as separatists and threats to national sovereignty. From China's legal perspective, Taiwan is not a foreign country but part of its own territory. That distinction is critical. If a global superpower can redefine a military abduction as a law enforcement action, the conceptual door is no longer closed. Moreover, Taiwan is China's internal affair, and Beijing can take real legal action against Lai Ching-te, just like arresting and punishing a corrupt Chinese provincial leader. From a purely operational standpoint, Beijing is far more capable of executing such an action against Taiwan than the US was in Venezuela. Taiwan is geographically close to the Chinese mainland, and the Taiwan Strait is narrow and shallow. The PLA conducts regular exercises simulating strikes, blockades, and decapitation operations, and those drills can turn into real combat at any time. Beijing has deeper intelligence penetration capabilities focused on Taiwan's political and military leadership than the US intelligence. A targeted operation involving special forces insertion, rapid extraction, and cyber and electronic warfare to blind defenses is not beyond China's technical capacity. In this area, Beijing is even better than Washington. Beijing has way more kung fu pandas than the United States. The real constraints are not military. They are political and strategic. Despite having the capability, Beijing has refrained from such an action for several reasons, including the risk of escalation, which could give the US and its allies an excuse to sanction China, as they did with Russia. Even if capturing Lai Ching-te does not trigger a military response from the United States and its allies as expected, potentially leading to a regional or global war, Beijing does not want to risk its economic development and social stability. Taiwan is there and no one can take it away. Beijing can wait till the last moment it deems necessary. Unlike the US in Venezuela, China does not face immediate domestic political pressure to act. Beijing believes long-term trends, economic gravity, military balance, and political fatigue favor eventual reunification without extreme measures. However, the Venezuela case has changed the equation. What the US did to Venezuela has weakened Beijing's arguments for restraint. If Washington can ignore Congress, bypass international organizations, and use criminal charges for regime change, Beijing can argue, at least rhetorically, that it would, without feeling guilty, do the same to another sovereign state like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Burma, to name a few. Taiwan is a province of China, as shown on the island's car license plates, so Beijing will find more convincing excuses if it wants to seize Lai Ching-te or Shenboyang. It does not mean China will take immediate action. But it reshapes the internal debate within Chinese strategic circles. The question shifts from "is this unthinkable" to "under what conditions would this be justified?" In April 2026, when Donald Trump visits Beijing, President Xi Jinping will likely learn from his US counterpart how to capture Lai Ching-te without arousing any psychological discomfort in the US and other Western powers. The deeper issue is not Taiwan or Venezuela specifically. It is the return of personalized, leader-driven power politics. Donald Trump can only pretend to be tough, as his days in the White House are numbered. As early as late 2027 or early 2028, his influence in the United States will diminish. President Xi Jinping may continue to rule China for another 5 or 10 years. He is a real giant, not merely a national leader for 1 or 2 terms. Weaker states or regions' leadership now exists in a world where the physical safety of government heads can no longer be guaranteed. In the foreseeable future, more and more leaders will show their due respect to China, especially Lai Ching-te and the Philippine president. However, China capturing Lai Ching-te is not likely in the near term. The costs remain extraordinarily high. But after Venezuela, it is no longer correct to say it is unimaginable. The question the world should now ask is not only what China might do, but what kind of world is being normalized. In a world where power decides legality, and legality is written after the operation is complete, and at a time when everyone is aware that might is always right, we face a far more unstable future. It is not only for Taiwan, for the Philippines, for Latin America, but it is also for everyone else.